Hi, I'm Helen Collard, and welcome back to the Business Creators Community Book Club for June. We are currently reading TA Today by Ian Stewart and Vann joins. So, this is introducing you all to the concept of transactional analysis, which is a fascinating subject. If you haven't, if you don't know what it is, go back to episodes 2 and episode 1 and have a look at those summaries and then come back here. So this is episode 3 in our series on TA Today, a new introduction to transactional analysis by Ian Stewart and Vann joins. I'm genuinely excited about this one because today is where the whole framework becomes real, properly, practically real. So, quick recap for anyone joining us partway through. In episode 1, we talked about where the inner critic comes from, the messages we absorbed as children long before we had the ability to question them, and how those messages are at the root of imposter syndrome. In episode 2, we went further into the framework itself and we looked at the parent, adult, and child ego states. We looked at the nurturing and critical parent, the free and adapted child, and the adult state as part of us that can assess the here and now clearly without the distortion of old programming. So if you haven't heard those 2 episodes yet, I'd really recommend going back to them because today builds directly on that foundation. But I'm also going to give you enough as we go so that you will not feel lost. Because today we're talking about what happens when 2 people's ego states meet. Eric Berne, this is based on the work of Eric Berne, psychologist, psychotherapist. Eric Berne calls this a transaction, and it's actually where the whole field gets its name, transactional analysis. The analysis of what happens ego state to ego state when people communicate. So this is the part of the book when I read it, it made me think about every difficult conversation I've ever had in a completely different way. Arguments with people close to me, tricky moments with clients, even moments in my own head, honestly, where I felt like 2 different versions of me were having a row. Have you ever had that? It's so frustrating. This will shed some light onto it. So let's get into it. Today we're talking about transactions, crossed transactions, the patterns that repeat in our relationships, and how all of this shows up at work in your business, with your clients, in your team if you have one, and in the way you relate to the people you're building all this for. So let's start with the basic unit of this whole framework, a transaction. So in TA Today, Stewart and Joyce describe a transaction as an exchange between 2 people made up of a stimulus and a response. So one person says or does something, that's a stimulus. The other person says or does something back, that's the response. And critically, both halves of that exchange come from a particular ego state. So every single thing you say to another person is coming from somewhere, either your parent, your adult, or your child. And whatever they say back is coming from one of their 3 states too. So this sounds simple, but it's genuinely one of the most useful things you will ever learn because most miscommunication, and I mean most, comes down to a mismatch in which ego states are talking to which. So Eric Berne described 2 broad types of transactions, complementary transactions and crossed transactions. So let's take them one at a time because this is where it gets really practical. So, complementary transactions. A complementary transaction is one where the response comes from the ego state that the stimulus was aimed at and goes back to the ego state that sent it. In other words, it lands where it was meant to land and the reply goes back to where it came from. So let me give you an example because that sentence alone is quite a lot to take in. So imagine you say to a colleague in a calm, straightforward voice, "Could you send me that file by lunchtime?" That is an adult to adult stimulus. You're setting a clear, reasonable request, assessing the situation as it is. And imagine they reply, sure, I'll have it to you by then. Also adult to adult. So that's clean, clear, no charge to it, easy. That's a complementary transaction. Adult talking to adult, adult replying to adult, smooth, functional. This is the kind of exchange that makes business relationships and honestly any relationship feel easy. But here's the thing, complementary transactions don't only happen adult to adult. They can happen in other combinations too, and they can still feel complete even if they're not particularly healthy. So imagine someone says in a sharp parental tone, you've left this until the last minute, haven't you? That's critical parent talking down to what Byrne would call the child position. And imagine the other person responds, I know, I'm sorry, I'll try harder. That's the adapted child replying upward to the parent. That's also a complementary transaction. It's complete, it fits. The stimulus went from parent to child, and the response came right back from child to parent. No crossing, no confusion. But you can probably feel just hearing that example that something about it isn't right, even though it's complete in the technical TA sense. This is parent-child dynamic playing out between two adults. And if this becomes the default pattern in a relationship, at work, in a marriage, between business partners, it becomes genuinely corrosive over time. One person is always parenting, the other is always being parented. And neither the critical parent nor the adapted child is the most resourceful, capable version of either person. And this is really important because I think a lot of people assume no conflict means healthy communication. But a relationship can run along smoothly with zero crossed transactions and still be deeply imbalanced. Because the pattern itself, parent to child, again and again, is not a relationship between equals. So crossed transactions. What is a cross transaction? So talking about cross transactions, this is important because this is where most conflict actually happens. A crossed transaction is when the response comes from a different ego state than the one the stimulus was aimed at, or it's directed at a different ego state than the one that sent it. Somebody says something expecting one kind of reply and gets a completely different, and it jars. It's like a trigger. So this is the moment in a conversation when you think, oh, well, that escalated quickly, or I don't know what just happened, but it suddenly feels tense. So let's go back to that file example. Could you send me that file by lunchtime? Adult to adult, a simple, reasonable request. Now imagine that the response is, why is it always me who has to drop everything? You never ask anyone else. That's not an adult reply. That's adapted child reacting defensively, possibly responding to old material about being criticised or always being the one who's relied upon or never being appreciated. The stimulus was aimed at the adult, but the response came from the child. The lines have crossed. And here's what's fascinating. The original person who simply asked a reasonable adult question often gets pulled into the cross too. Can you imagine if you have a response like that? Why is it always me who has to drop everything? You never ask anyone else. The tendency is to then slip in with their own critical parent. I'm not being unreasonable. I just need the file. And now you have two people, neither speaking from their adult, locked into a parent-child loop that has absolutely nothing to do with the original file. So Stewart and Joins make the point that crossed transactions are where communication breaks down. And almost every conflict in a marriage, a friendship, a client relationship, a team can be traced back to a crossed transaction that nobody noticed crossing. So the genuinely useful thing here to understanding this is that you can start to notice it as it happens. Not perfectly, not every time, but enough to make a difference. Because the moment you notice this is crossed, you have a choice. You can stay in the cross and let it escalate, or you can, and this takes real practice, deliberately bring your own adult back to the table and offer a clean adult to adult response, even when the other person is coming at you from parent or child. Sometimes just one person bringing their adult back in is enough to settle the whole exchange. Not always, but often. It's often enough, and it's worth knowing how to do. So let's bring this into real life, because I think this is where the framework becomes transformative. Think about a relationship in your life where the same argument seems to happen over and over. Just wearing different clothes, if you like. Maybe it's about chores or money or time or whose turn it is to deal with something. The topic changes, but the shape of the argument is identical every time. What's almost certainly happening is a repeating pattern of crossed transactions. One person reliably starts from a particular ego state, often without realizing, and the other person reliably responds from a particular state in return. And because both people are responding from old familiar patterns rather than from the actual present moment, the argument has a kind of inevitability to it. It's not really about the dishes, it's two old scripts meeting again, like they've met 100 times before. And I think this is enormously freeing to understand, because it takes some of the heat and the personal sting out of repeated conflict. It's not that your partner or your friend or your sister is fundamentally unreasonable, or that you are fundamentally too sensitive. It's that two sets of old conditioning are colliding in a very predictable way, and neither adult has been invited into the room. And once you can start to see the pattern, you can start to interrupt it. Not by getting the other person to change, you can't do that. And trying usually makes things worse. But by changing your half of the transaction, if you can notice in the moment, I'm about to respond from my adapted child here, and instead offer something from your adult, calm, clear, curious rather than defensive, the whole shape of the exchange shifts. Sometimes immediately, sometimes it takes the other person a moment to catch up because they were braced for the old pattern and you didn't give it to them. This is also, by the way, why some relationships feel easy and others feel exhausting. The easy ones tend to have a higher proportion of adult to adult transactions, not because the people are simpler or less complicated or have less history. Everyone has history. But because, for whatever reason, the relationship allows both people to show up from their adult more of the time. That's worth noticing and protecting whenever you find it. So now let's bring this into your business, because this is genuinely where I think the framework pays for itself many times over. So think about a client relationship that's felt difficult, not necessarily a disaster, just one that drained more energy than it should have. So very often what's happening is a transaction pattern that got set up early and never shifted. A client who emails from a critical parent position, terse, demanding, slightly accusatory, invites a response. And if you respond from adapted child, over-explaining, over-apologizing, immediately conceding, you've just confirmed the shape of the relationship. From that point on, that's the dynamic. Every email continues the pattern. So the alternative isn't to fight parent with parent. That just escalates into a different unpleasant dynamic. The alternative is to consistently, calmly respond from adult. Acknowledge what's been said, addressing the actual content without shrinking and without retaliating. It can feel like a strange thing to practice, almost like you're being too neutral, but adult to adult responses held consistently tend to draw the other person's adult out too, over time. Not always. Some people are deeply committed to their critical parent or their adapted child, and no amount of adult energy from you will shift that. But often it works. And even when it doesn't shift the other person, it protects you from being pulled into a draining pattern that isn't yours to carry. So here's a work-specific one that I think will land for a lot of you. Think about how you talk to yourself when you're behind on something, or when a launch doesn't go the way you hoped, or when you compare your business to someone else's. Now, if that internal voice sounds like, you always do this, you never finish what you start, everyone else has it together except you, that's critical parent talking to your child. And if your response to that voice is to spiral, to feel small, to want to give up, or to overcorrect by working yourself into exhaustion to make up for it, that's your adapted child responding right on cue. This is a transaction happening entirely inside your own head. Parent to child, child back to parent, going round and round, and your adult never gets a word in. The intervention is the same as in any other relationship. Notice the pattern, notice which voice is speaking, and then, and this takes real repeated practice, bring your adult into the conversation. Not to suppress the critical parent and not to silence the frightened child, but to sit between them and ask, what's actually true here? What do I actually know about this situation? What would be a fair, accurate, useful next step? That's self-leadership in TA language, and it's a skill, not a personality trait, which means it can be built. So if you have anyone working with or for you, so that could be a VA, a contractor, collaborator, this becomes really important too, because the position you communicate from sets the tone for your whole working relationship. If you find yourself constantly directing from a critical parent position, correcting, controlling, pointing out what's wrong, you will likely find people around you becoming more adapted child in response, either overly compliant and reluctant to bring you their own ideas, or quietly rebellious, doing just enough and no more. Neither is the relationship you actually want. Adult to adult delegation, clear, respectful, treating the other person as a capable equal who can be trusted with a task, tends to invite their adult forward too. People rise to the level they're met at far more often than we give them credit for. So I want to introduce one more concept from TA today before we wrap up, because I think it's genuinely one of the most useful things in the whole book, and it explains a particular kind of conversation that I suspect every single one of you will recognise. Stewart and Joynes describe what's called an ulterior transaction. Now, this is where a transaction happens on two levels at once. There's the social level, the words that are actually said on the surface, and there's a psychological level, the real message underneath that's actually doing the work. So here's a simple example. Someone says in a perfectly pleasant tone, I suppose some people have time to take long lunches. On the social level, that's just an observation, adult even. But the psychological level, the real message, is something more like, I'm annoyed that you took a long lunch and I want you to feel guilty about it. That's a covert, critical parent message smuggled inside an apparently neutral sentence. And the response to an ulterior transaction is always almost aimed at the psychological message, not the words. So if you've ever found yourself feeling oddly defensive after a comment that on paper wasn't even critical, that's why. You weren't responding to the sentence, you were responding to what was actually being communicated underneath it. Now, this happens constantly in business. The client who says, no rush at all, whenever you get to it, in a tone that makes it very clear there is, in fact, a rush. The colleague who says that's an interesting choice about a decision they clearly disapprove of. The family member who says, well, I suppose you know best about your business, in a tone that says the opposite. So once you can hear the difference between the social messages and the psychological message, a huge amount of confusing tension in your relationships start to make sense. You're not imagining it. There often really is a second message underneath the first, and naming that to yourself, even just privately, even if you choose not to address it directly, takes away a lot of its power to unsettle you. So let's bring episodes 1, 2, and 3 together, because I think there's a really clear, simple thread running through all of this. Episode 1, the voice in your head that tells you you're not enough was built in childhood, from messages you absorbed long before you could question them. It's not the truth, it's a recording. Episode 2, that voice lives in your critical parent, and alongside it, you also have a nurturing parent, a free child full of creativity and joy, an adapted child who learned to keep you safe by shrinking or complying or rebelling, and crucially, an adult who can assess any situation as it actually is right now and choose your response freely. So here in episode 3, every interaction you have with another person is a transaction between ego states. When those states line up, adult to adult, communication flows easily. When they cross, conflict and confusion follow. And underneath the words, there is often a second psychological message doing the real work. What ties all three together is this: awareness is the whole game. You can't change a pattern you can't see. The critical parent will keep running its old script. The adapted child will keep shrinking or rebelling. The same cross transactions will keep repeating in your closest relationships and in your business until the moment you notice. And noticing is genuinely available to you starting today. It won't be perfect, not catching every single transaction in real time. None of us do that, including me, including the authors of the book, I'm sure. But noticing more, building the muscle, catching it after the fact at first, and then with practice, catching it a little sooner each time, until eventually you catch it at the moment and you get to choose. That's choice. That's the adult. That's the part of you that was always capable of this. It's not about becoming a different person. It's about remembering which part of you's been there all along, underneath the old scripts, ready to respond to your actual life rather than recording. So I want to leave you with a practice for this week, and it's a simple one. Notice one transaction, just one. It might be a conversation that goes well and you can identify, oh, that was adult to adult. That's why it feels easy. Or it might be a conversation that goes sideways and you can look back afterwards and think, I see where it crossed. I see which ego state I was in. I see which one they were in. And you don't need to fix anything. You don't have to have the perfect response ready next time. Just notice. That's the whole practice and it's enough. So if this series has resonated with you, and I really hope it has, come and share in the Business Creators community. I'd love to know which part of this has landed hardest or which relationship you started to see differently. These conversations always go somewhere rich, and you're never the only one to recognise yourself in this. So this has been the third episode in our series on TA Today, a new introduction to transactional analysis by Ian Stewart and Vann joins. If you enjoyed these series, the book itself goes much further than I can cover in this month. It's well worth picking up, and I'll link it in the description as always. Thank you so much for being there. I'm Helen Collard, and thank you for being part of this community. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.